I'm going to walk through the first part of Friedman, in the first about 2/3 of it. And I do not have, by the way, the same copy that you have. For some reason, the PDF I posted online lacks the Friedman reading, so I had to find another one. You should have it in your paper copy, and should be able to follow along because the paragraphing is essentially the same, and this one isn't nearly as tough as Keynes. So if you survived Keynes, you should be able to follow along with Friedman. And again, it's a very famous piece. In fact, some of its phrases and clauses have ended up in Supreme Court cases. And Friedman was probably best known in the 60s and 70s. And he won a Nobel Prize, I believe, around the mid-70s or so. And he came out of the University of Chicago. And he's become something of a hero to libertarians in economics. And the School of Economics in University of Chicago is known for what Friedman had developed there. So some of his points are a little bit controversial, and there are other approaches to things that are just as sound economically. Today, you can, find, for example, Joseph Stiglitz and others who are also Nobel Prize winners, and take a different view on things. But Friedman's perspective is undeniably worth considering and undeniably sound in it. So be aware of that. He is embraced by people who are of a libertarian perspective, but others, if you want to see a different perspective, economically sound one, look for somebody like Joseph Stiglitz or Krugman, Paul Krugman. Both of them have Krugman and Stiglitz both have Nobel Prizes, and so did Friedman. But those, what they will do is they agree on the empirical nature of economics, the way it can be measured. Where they take a different perspective is in the ideology, in their value system. You can see from this that Friedman is adamantly in favor of free markets, and minimally for interference from a government, either from the courts or from an executive branch or legislative. So that's Friedman's perspective on it. His value system, his ideology will be different. But in general, when you see good economic, in this case, an editorial, the basic ability to measure things and see things and know that they work, that's going to be a characteristic of Friedman, of Krugman, of Stiglitz, and many others who understand the economics. And Friedman, by the way, was a big fan of Keynes. So let me go through it here, and I'll just cover the basics of it. And I won't cover the entire essay. I'll cover the early part of it and point out a few aspects of it that you really need to understand, especially if you write on this essay, and also some areas where there are misunderstandings. So when he starts this off in much the same way that you saw with Smith and with Keynes, with a little bit of understatement. When I hear businessmen speak eloquently about the social responsibilities of business in a free enterprise system, I am reminded of the wonderful line about the Frenchman who discovers at the age of 79 that he has been speaking prose all his life. So what Friedman's saying there is that that's what we speak already. That's already going on. So there should be no adjustment in order to adopt prose, because that's what you speak in. Prose is essentially a way of writing that isn't structured like poetry. So it's basically what most people would understand as normal. Okay? So he's being a bit sarcastic there because he sees business as already performing a socially beneficial act by working in its own interests. And then he goes on in the second paragraph. A corporation is an artificial person, and in this sense, any may have artificial responsibilities, but business as a whole cannot be said to have responsibilities, even in this vague sense. Now, the phrase artificial person has actually been placed into a Supreme Court ruling within the last, I believe it was about 15 years ago, and that corporations were artificial persons with certain rights. And the whole idea here for Friedman is that this is an artificial person. It doesn't carry the same moral weight that a person would carry. And this is an area where there's a misunderstanding of Friedman. He is known to be an advocate, a very staunch advocate of free markets, but he's not for amoral behavior, and that's a misunderstanding. He still does believe, even within business, individuals have moral responsibilities. He's not the person, he's not the moral philosopher, say that Smith was, who would set that out. But he's clear that assigning moral responsibilities to corporations misses that they're artificial. Okay? Jumping down a little bit, in a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has a direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible, while conforming to their basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical customs. And so this is, again, related to the last point. He is not advocating underhanded, illegal, immoral behavior by the business. The business doesn't become a front to cover, destructive, unlawful behavior. That's not what he's advocating. Ethical custom and law both play their part in business. And he's going to get to the issue of law in a bit. And this gets where we get corporations working at cross purposes. Essentially, they are not part of the legislative branch of a government. So let's go down a little bit further. And he takes it up again. Of course, the corporate executive is also a person in his own right. As a person, he may have many other responsibilities that he recognizes or assumes voluntarily. To his family, his conscience, his feelings of charity, his church, his club, his city, his country. He may feel compelled by these responsibilities to devote part of his income to causes he regards as worthy, to refuse to work for a particular corporation, even to leave his job, for example, to join his country's armed forces. If we wish, we may refer some of these responsibilities as social responsibilities. And now, for many people, these can be troubling for more than one reason. These ethical responsibilities, or these moral responsibilities, are to your family, to your conscience, what you think is right, his feelings of charity, whom we should do things for, his church, his clubs, his city, his country. And this is important because even city and his country, this means that the corporate responsibility is not to the country. This really goes back to Smith, and that corporations, really in his time, these would be industries, reach across boundaries, and markets reach across boundaries. They don't have loyalty to a country. Even though Smith did see businesses who were left to pursue markets in their own way would ultimately enrich the country, he did not see them as inherently British or Scottish or inherently French. They needed to pursue their profits where they thought fit. Okay? If we wish, he says at the end, we may refer to these responsibilities as social responsibilities. He does not see social responsibilities as being inherently flawed. All those personal responsibilities you have to your family, to charity, your church, and your club's country, those are all social responsibilities. They fall upon the individual, not upon the corporation. Okay? In each of these cases, the corporate executive would be spending someone else's money for the general social interest, insofar as his actions in accord with the social responsibilities reduce returns to stockholders. he is spending their money. So in other words, if the corporate executive starts undertaking some kind of work to help the local schools or a homeless shelter or something like that, he is essentially placing a tax on the shareholders of the company he's working for, to do that good. Now, Friedman's very clear. That is an issue that should be decided within government circles. In other words, through elections, through parliamentary procedures, through executive actions within government. Those are perfectly responsible behaviors within a democracy. They are not the behaviors that you should undertake in a corporation. Then you are deferring the expense onto the corporation as long as the corporation is taking it on. Now, this is very important for considering these different articles if you're going to use this in with The Economist. Notice that many corporations, you'll be aware of this, advertise their social responsibilities. Whenever you go into Target or Starbucks or many other corporations, you will see that they are undertaking business practices where they tell you that they are doing something responsible and ethical. But notice that they are advertising that they are doing this. They are, in other words, creating an image of being socially concerned. That actually helps them as a company. That this idea that they are a ruthless company is covered up by the image that they are a charitable company. So the customers feel good about shopping at that location. People feel better when they realize that their coffee beans come from, shared farming or some kind of, equitable treatment of farmers. They are more likely to go to that store and buy that coffee if they see that. It is an image, though. Keep in mind that the corporation is still focused on profits, but it's using that image as an advertising ploy. Okay, so they are not using that image to tax the shareholders. They're using it to attract customers. That's something that Friedman doesn't discuss as much, but you will see it in many locations, in many corporations today. What Friedman points out is that if he starts undertaking what might be called social responsibility, he's taxing the shareholders. Okay, let me go ahead a bit. This is the basic reason why the doctrine of social responsibility involves the acceptance of the socialist view that the political mechanisms, not market mechanisms, are the appropriate way to determine the allocations of scarce resources to alternative uses. Now remember what Smith noted is that markets will take advantage of resources appropriately as they can get a hold of them, and they will do it as efficiently as possible. Once you introduced a social responsibility as an important principle, you've just distorted how that efficiency would work within the market. No longer do we buy the cheapest supplies that will do the trick. We instead buy from this group who employs people of this type or that type. Under those circumstances, you've just handed off the responsibility onto your customers and the responsibility onto your shareholders. Essentially, you've taxed people without their permission. That's what he's pointing out. Okay? And then we wrap it up with a couple more points. Aside from the question of fact, I share Adam Smith's skepticism. And again, notice Adam Smith doesn't go away. About the benefits that can be expected from those who affect to trade for the public good. This argument must be rejected on the grounds of principle. So he's pointing out, and again, Adam Smith's job, his day job, was as a philosophy professor, a moral philosophy professor. And he was the first one to really express the skepticism about people who say that they are acting for the public good. that if they are actually doing that, these companies are not going to be around for long because other companies will outperform them. Okay? So that idea that they are acting, then it's affected, and in other words, they're taking an emotional stance, which would imply that they're feeling towards some goal. He sees that as insincere at best. So what it amounts to is an assertion that those who favor the taxes and expenditures in question have failed to persuade the majority of their fellow citizens to be of like mind, and that they are seeking to attain by undemocratic procedures, in other words, using their position within the company, okay, not within the city, within the state, within the country. What they cannot attain by democratic procedures. In a free society, it's hard for evil people to do evil, especially since one man's good is another man's evil. So what Friedman's pointing out is often social responsibility is instead one small group's idea of what should be done. They cannot convince a majority to follow along with them, so they try to pressure a corporation to follow that end. So it's a failure within democracy that you get social responsibility being pushed upon corporations. That's how Friedman sees it. And he was really, he wrote a book on capitalism and democracy and how he saw them when they operated properly to be exactly the best fit. Okay? So I'll hold off there. I don't have any more highlighted. I'll leave it there. But understand Friedman is a certain type of perspective, and it's still out there circulating today. And he's a seminal figure within libertarian politics. And this is just one legitimate viewpoint you should be aware of. Other perspectives you could be, and it's more often comes up from libertarians or from Republican perspectives. Other perspectives that you should be aware of are more liberal would be Friedman, Stiglitz and Krugman also, and they write in various publications as the Wall Street Journal. And this one, I believe this originally appeared in the New York Times Magazine. Krugman writes in the New York Times, and I believe Stiglitz often appears in the Washington Post. But you'll see this echo in many of today's discussions of economics. So Friedman, even though he died, I believe, about 10, 15 years ago, his ideas are still alive and well. And he was an adherent of Keynes, which might strike some people as odd, but he understood how Keynes, keeping capital in capitalism, kept markets working. Okay, so always understand their relationship to each other. And you'll see many of the same ideas playing out in other people who understand economics today. Okay, I'll leave it there. Take care, you guys.